Well, how much cheese am I willing to tolerate to get unapologetically nerdy fantasy? Deathstalker showed me my limits. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. The IMDb synopsis for Deathstalker reads, a remake of the cult classic 1983 sword and sorcery film, which I've not seen. I've seen a number of fantasy movies from the 80s, have not seen the original Deathstalker. The kingdom of Abraxan is under siege by the Dreadites, heralds of the long-dead sorcerer Necromemnon. When Deathstalker recovers a cursed amulet from a corpse-strewn battlefield, he's marked by dark magic and magic with a CK, by the way, marked by dark magic and hunted by monstrous assassins. To survive, he must break the curse and face the rising evil. Death is just the beginning of great adventure. Okay, so what is this basic animal? Well, the tone I would describe as being like a bloody, gory, violent version of the Hercules and Xena shows from the 90s. Which is not really what I think it's pulling inspiration. I mean, again, I haven't seen the original Deathstalker, so maybe I'll let other people talk about comparing it to the original. I can't. I'm just going to compare it to generally the fantasy movies that I saw from the 80s. But it's not like most of those fantasy movies. It's not the same tone quite as Krull, as Beastmaster, or Dragon Slayer, or even what I remember of the Conan movies. Those all had some comic relief, and if you watch them today, in many ways, they have effects, practical effects that look bad or fake today, we would say, but they still were trying to take themselves seriously. I also would not compare this to more modern B fantasy movies starting in like the mid 2000s, the 2010s, stuff like that. I'm thinking of Dungeons and Dragons Wrath of the Dragon God or the Mythica movies. It's definitely not as serious as, say, something like Solomon Kane. All of those movies had smaller budgets, but they were taking themselves more seriously, even though they were leaning into nerdy amounts of fantasy that most movies are not. I've said a number of times before that it seems to me that since the Lord of the Rings movies that Peter Jackson directed, we did not get the influx of fantasy movies for adults that I really thought and hoped we would get. Instead, we got a lot of fantasy movies and fantasy franchises for teens and children. So I'm thinking of Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, all that kind of stuff that's aimed more at a younger audience. And I really felt just neglected. And even in the Lord of the Rings movies themselves, again, I haven't read the original books, but magic was like shied away from visually until like the third movie in that series. We didn't see the Dungeons and Dragons style purple energy flying around and really getting nerdy visually. It was like two Jedis fighting when the two wizards go at it. So like the more serious I feel like fantasy is treated in movies and in TV shows, the less of that visual spectacle you're going to get. The less they're going to lean in visually and conceptually into nerdy D&D-ish type concepts. And the more you lean into that, the lower the budget is going to tend to be, and the less serious it's going to tend to take itself. And that really bears out in this remake of Deathstalker. I think the tone here has vibes of a Dungeons and Dragons session where, you know, the backdrop and the stakes are theoretically serious. When the dungeon master presents the scenario, yeah, it sounds like some pretty serious stuff. But as soon as the player characters start interacting with that world, they bring a bunch of, you know, stupid jokes and not taking things seriously many times. Not all players, certainly. But they're players just kind of messing around, trying to get a laugh from their buddies. And so you get this this kind of like contrast between this ostensibly serious set of stakes and the way the protagonists are reacting to it because they're just controlled by people having fun at a gaming table. If you dislike that kind of leaning into stupid humor and just kind of not taking it seriously as much as I do. I really dislike that. I want the world to at least try and take itself seriously, and then I can forgive the cheap looking effects. Just lean into the nerdy concepts, try to take yourself seriously, and I can put up with a lot. But we still, at least with all the lack of seriousness in the proceedings here, we do get the usual trade-off. There are loads and loads of unapologetically nerdy fantasy elements throughout this movie that are not seen in most fantasy movies to the degree that they are seen here. And I think you get a hint of that in the trailer, but really there's a lot more even than in the trailer. As far as the cast and the performance styles go, it's a mix of overdone and underdone and just unconvincing on either end of the spectrum. But the dialogue really informs the acting style. There's dialogue here that feels a bit like it was just come up with on the spot by dudes rolling dice, things that were a little bit anachronistic or bringing elements of our modern world into this other fantasy land. So the script, I think, informed probably the actors' choices and the way this was directed. As far as the stunts and the visuals go, it's mostly practical, which I always appreciate. There are some post-production effects, but they're like 90s style effects, some 80s. There's even some stop motion that they bring in near the end. What interested me about seeing this movie was the fact that it was written and directed by one of the co-writers and co-directors of The Void, which was a crowd-funded, Lovecraftian, heavily Lovecraftian-inspired horror movie from, 5 years or plus ago. And that almost immediately became one of my favorite horror movies of all time. They used a lot of practical effects there, but they also used filming techniques to hide the monster, to not display the weaknesses of those practical effects in a way that really served the movie very well, so that I could look at those practical effects and say, man, these are some of the best practical effects. They almost felt like an evolution, a step or two beyond what was already accomplished by some of the best in the 80s. Well, this did not feel like an evolution of the 80s. It felt like the movie was aiming to actually reproduce the subpar quality of practical effects of some B-80s movies. Like when a pixel graphics game is created and the creator really strictly limits themselves to what the capabilities of the NES would be. There's lots of pixel graphics games that are retro in that sense, but they're not actually trying to limit themselves to that degree. To a smaller number of them actually like, no, we are only going to do what would be possible on an NES. And I feel like that is it's not perfectly consistent for sure, but I feel like that's a lot of what's going on in how they approach the effects of this movie, even how they approach some of the post-production, some of the acting to some degree. It's like, no, we're going to limit ourselves to the quality of B-80s fantasy movies. And I think for some people that's definitely going to have some charm. I really would have liked to see what they could have done if they were really trying, not trying to mimic something bad from the past, but really seeing what they could do on a limited budget using practical effects for the most part today. Like I think how the way The Void was approached. I don't often talk about music, but I do have to say the score is a mix of orchestra and rock, and it's got a really memorable theme. It's definitely feels of the era, but at the same time in a way that didn't strike me as cheesy. I was ready to accept this before the movie really started to go off the rails, which it progressively does in terms of leaning into humor and silliness and stuff like that. But at the beginning of the movie, I was accepting of this, even though it felt dated. There was a charm about it that I was feeling. And still do, even when the credits rolled. All right. Is there anything of moral, philosophical, or spiritual significance going on in this thing? Nope. I mean, I suppose technically maybe there's some cliche morals that are thrown in there, but they can't be taken seriously. They're not trying to be taken seriously. This is not a movie interested in getting you to think about anything. So yeah, nothing really there. No idea what your tastes are in movies, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, oh man, okay, you gotta skip this one. Just watch the trailer, enjoy it, imagine what that movie might have been like in your head. That's not the one you're gonna end up seeing. Instead, watch the Mythica series again. Watch Dungeons and Dragons: Wrath of the Dragon God again. Watch Krull or Dragon Slayer again. You know what? Get the riff tracks for Krull. You've been meaning to do that for a while. It's been a long time since you watched Krull. There you go. That's your plan. This one is not rated. I would personally give it an R equivalent rating for bloody violence and gore. Thankfully, it does not dip into the nudity that, according to IMDb, the original Deathstalker had. So it's not interested in going in that direction at all, and I really appreciate that. And those are all my thoughts for now on Deathstalker. Right now I'd like to take some time to write a tune for pre-made rhyme. The lyrics kind of never change, but the melody gets rearranged. I never know what I'll create to say how much I appreciate Dan Excel, Gabriel Stinson, Winston Crutchfield, Lee Bray, Joel Nelson, Jake Berry, John Wilkerson, Daryl Nawu, and Lucas Kitchen. Thank you for supporting me and SBP and CGC. And now to all who hear this tune, thank you as well. Please come back soon. Want to hear your name in song? Check out our page on Patreon. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this review possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining over at patreon.com/spiritbladeproductions. Then I hope you'll check out our podcast and stay connected to all CGC content at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.